Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Weber, and I'm here on behalf of the National Milk Producers Federation YC program to introduce our speaker today. Welcome to the 2021 World Dairy Expo. Today's seminar is Dairy Cow Productivity. More important to the profitability of your dairy operation than you think, presented by Peter Vitaliano, Vice President of Economic Policy and Market Research for the National Milk Producers Federation. This seminar is also sponsored by the National Milk Producers Federation. Dairy cow productivity is obviously an important determinant of dairy farm profitability through its influence on cost of production and volume of milk sold. But it also plays a key role in the larger dairy economy through its effect on milk prices. In this seminar, Peter Vitaliano, the Chief Economist for the National Milk Producers Federation, will discuss the broader influence of changing dairy cow productivity in this larger sense through its interaction with dairy cow numbers, domestic milk and dairy product consumption, dairy exports, and milk prices. Vitaliano is responsible for all economic analysis supporting the Federation's programs related to domestic and international dairy policy. He holds a Ph.D. in agricultural economics from the University of Wisconsin and degrees in mathematics from Pennsylvania State University and Indiana University. This seminar has been approved for continuing education credits from the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists. Forms are available in the back if you are interested in ARPAS credits. I would like to ask everyone to please silence their cell phones at this time and welcome Peter up to the microphone.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. When I was invited to present this seminar, which I'm very honored to have been, it was suggested that I talk on the topic of dairy cow productivity being more important than dairy cow numbers, obviously with a farm level focus. I'm not a farm level dairy economist, as my title suggests. I look at national and international economic issues, particularly from a policy perspective and from a forecast perspective. But I was invited to choose any other topic that they thought was appropriate. I decided to stick with that basic theme of dairy cow productivity being more important than dairy cow numbers, but doing my own very different take on it, sort of from a macro, overall dairy economic look. So consider this presentation a broad, non-technical economic explanation of some key aspects of the dairy industry. A little bit non-traditional from what you may be used to seeing with dairy economic presentations. Consider it almost like a hitchhiker's guide to the U.S. dairy industry, to kind of do a little riff on the title of some very popular books a few years ago. It highlights some relatively constant but important factors that nevertheless, constant as they may be, contribute to volatility in the industry, particularly prices. And I'm going to focus on dairy cow productivity and consumption of milk and dairy products. I'm going to start with the consumption part of it. I'm going to go through a bunch of slides showing what dairy consumption in total and for individual products has looked like over the last 25 years or so. It's a period that we have particularly good data from USDA. And I'm going to show a bunch of slides that all will kind of look like this. What I define as total consumption is consumption primarily of U.S. produced milk and dairy products over time, and it's commercial use that this measures. It's not measuring product, particularly from the early years of these charts, that was purchased under the old dairy price support program and then later donated domestically, internationally for food assistance purposes or subsidized through export. That doesn't count on here. But about a third of the way through these charts, the world dairy industry changed from a heavily subsidized one to one that was commercially viable on a par with the U.S. dairy industry, sometimes even stronger. And so those non-commercial, government-affected purchases, consumption, donations, that pretty much ended. We've had occasional revivals of that, like we had last year during the pandemic. So The red line is total consumption. The blue line is milk production in the United States. And the green line is domestic commercial consumption basically in the United States. The red line tends to be above the blue line of production throughout most of this because the way USDA calculates commercial consumption, it includes imports, which is a pretty small, as I'll show you later, it's a pretty small part of the total picture, but nonetheless, it is sort of, to get a picture of what is totally consumed in this country, imports count as product coming in, and so that's important to get a picture of what total consumption looks like. But when you deduct commercial exports from that total consumption, you're left with domestic consumption only. So the overall chart in terms of milk equivalent shows that consumption has been going up fairly steadily. It's one of those constants. Overall consumption of milk and dairy products, that's domestic and international, has been a steady and very dependable resource that is very, very critical for dairy farmers. The way I look at it is if people do not consume milk and dairy products, the dairy industry does not have a job. The green line is tending to fall increasingly below the red line. That represents the growth of commercial exports. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. Let me go through these charts fairly quickly for individual key dairy products, starting with American type cheese, cheddar, and others. You'll notice that throughout this entire period, including current, there's not much difference between production and overall consumption. We don't import very much of this type of cheese. The green line is falling a little bit below, but not nearly as much as looking at the total picture. We don't export that much of this type of cheese. We need to do more, but that's for a future discussion. Other types of cheese, and this consists in terms of the total consumption picture of Italian type, particularly mozzarella driven by the pizza industry. You'll see that imports are a little more important for this type of cheese. Specialized European type cheeses are imported, and maybe a little bit more exports, but still not very much. Same picture with butter. We don't see an awful lot of imports of butter except during certain periods which are more price sensitive, domestic versus international prices, than with cheeses where the import picture is pretty, is maybe small, but is pretty steady. You'll see that butter imports tend to be periodic. The same thing with exports. We don't export very much butter during most of this period, but at a few points in the middle of this, we have done so. Fluid milk. Fluid milk is mostly a domestic industry. There's not much imports and exports, and a lot of what is exported is bulk milk being shipped to places like Mexico, which uses it to reconstitutes other products that are not necessarily fluid. In fact, mostly are not fluid. And we can't separate those out. So we really don't have a good read on trade in packaged fluid milk. And what we do import in specialized containers is often specialty products. So this is basically the picture in the U.S. Total consumption has been relatively constant throughout the beginning of this, and this is, again, total consumption. But then has started to decline fairly steadily since about 2010. If you break this down into, in this case, whole milk and reduced fat milk, you can see whole milk has been declining at the beginning of this period and reduced fat milk has been growing. That's been the result of a decades-long but ultimately misguided new set of nutritional advice from all the experts and mirrored by the U.S. government with ramifications in the school milk program and others, saying that consumption of even natural fats is bad for your cardiovascular health. That was for decades, that was the group thinking. That has been reversed in recent years. And U.S. dairy farmers, through their checkoff program, have been very instrumental in helping bring that about through the research funded by your checkoff. once that perception was starting to be reversed, it's taken a long time for the government regulations to get with it, like in school milk, but consumers who love the taste of fat went for it immediately, and their consumption of products like whole milk showed that. That rebounded very, very quickly. I'll show that in another context in a little bit. Consumers rapidly bailed out of reduced fat milk, as you can see, to the extent that it is sort of overpowering the more modest increase in whole milk, to the point where total sales of all milk, whole milk and reduced fat milk, have been declining. And that's another whole story that we could get into about what can be done about that. Let's switch to this picture, getting back to the total consumption, domestic consumption, for ingredient products. And here these charts look quite different. You can see that production of dry skim milk, which is the way USDA bundles up non-fat dry milk, a small amount of dry skim milk produced for animal use, and something called skim milk powder, which is a protein standardized non-fat dry milk that is sold primarily in export markets. Because with the protein standardization, it makes it easier for that product to be reconstituted into a whole variety of dairy products in what are often state-of-the-art milk plants in countries that are dairy deficit. You can see that at the beginning of this, non-fat dry skim milk was primarily, the commercial use of dry skim milk was primarily the same as total commercial use. Around 2003, 2004, consumption suddenly jumped up from domestic only use to equaling production. What happened is, again, what I've referred to earlier, the international markets, which have an enormous appetite for importing dairy ingredients like skim milk powder and other dry skim milk products, suddenly became commercially viable and on a price parity with the U.S. market. And so total consumption, commercial consumption, jumped up very quickly to equal production and has basically stayed very close to it ever since. We don't import much dry skim milk, and our exports are large and growing. You can just look at the numbers here. Recently, we're exporting, or let's say we're consuming domestically less than 1 billion pounds per year of dry skim milk, and we're consuming in total, including exports, well over 2.5 billion pounds. Dry whey, same sort of thing. Dry whey was never subject to government purchases, government removals. It's always been basically a free marketed product. We don't import very much of it, and we've been exporting a lot and in increasing volumes. But they've been going down. Well, that's just this one product. There's a whole complex of whey products, including concentrated protein wheys like whey protein concentrate. And here we see, again, total consumption is growing. We do import a fair amount of concentrated whey proteins, as you can see from this chart. And that's actually been growing a bit. But again, our exports have been growing to the point where domestic consumption is staying pretty constant overall. It's maybe growing at sort of the higher protein concentrations. But overall consumption has been growing. And you got the same basic situation with lactose, which is, we don't import very much of that. And again, it has never been really subject to government action. We have steady domestic consumption of lactose, but very strongly growing exports. And as a result, total consumption has been growing along with production very handsomely. Switching now to looking at the big picture for trade. This is a chart I've been doing for many, many years, showing what I call the U.S. dairy trade balance. It is a chart of the total milk solids, butterfat and skim milk solids, that we export as a percentage of U.S. production. and does the same thing on an equivalent basis for imports. You can see that we exported not much more than we imported for about the first third of this chart. Then exports took off and increased fairly steadily. They kind of plateaued around 2013 till just last year, but they've kind of broken out of that a little bit. We're on track to reach about 18% of our milk solids, probably a little less, maybe 17% when you look at what's likely to happen in the second half of the year. A significant proportion of the total milk solids we produce in this country are now going to the international market. It's a critical market. It's a growing one. Years ago, dairy, the big trade issue that dairy was concerned about was competition from imports. That was important at a time when the world market was heavily subsidized. It was not a commercial market. Many dairy-producing countries dumped a lot of their surplus products on the world market. World prices were terribly depressed. But around, again, as I mentioned earlier, around 2003, 2004, the world market, through changes in government's attitudes towards subsidies, growing middle-class incomes and consumption in developing countries that were dairy deficit, basically transformed the world market into a viable commercial market. It's been so ever since and will continue to be so. So imports dropped back down to between 3 and 4% of the industry, and import competition is yesterday's problem big time. It is not an issue. Occasionally, butterfat imports will flare up a little bit, but an industry that basically has only 3 to 4% competition from overseas product is an industry that basically the U.S. dairy farmers have this market, the domestic market, all to themselves for all practical purposes. Now, when you look at the composition of our exports on a basically a milk solids basis, you see that 80% very steadily throughout this almost entire period, about 80% of that is what I call ingredients, mostly dry skim milk, dry skim ingredients. That's dry milks of all kinds, all the whey complex, lactose, some other mixtures and specialty products. We don't export very much cheese and very much butter, or really other products. So what's really happening in exports, despite the healthy growing picture of our exports getting up now to maybe as high as 17% this year, is we're still mostly exporting our non-fat skim milk solids. The industry has long time had what I call a structural imbalance between the production and the commercial markets for milk fat and the production and commercial markets for skim milk solids. And that's reflected back when we had a price support program. There are many years when mostly what we purchased was non-fat dry milk. Didn't purchase much butter. There was a period, the height of the Atkins furor in the early 90s, where the price support program required a lot of butter, but that was an unusual and short-lived episode. You go back as far as the early 80s, and we bought a lot of cheese. We bought a lot of all dairy products. But in recent years, before the program was phased out as being basically no longer appropriate to the modern dairy industry, it was basically when government had to intervene either through price support purchases or subsidized exports, it was mostly non-fat dry milk, reflecting that structural surplus of skim milk solids. And that's reflected, if I go back to these dairy trade balance charts, this one looks like the one I just showed, but it's total skim milk solids only. So rather than approaching 18% this year, we're approaching about 24%. Almost a quarter of our skim milk solids that are produced in this country are going overseas, where there is a vibrant and growing market for it. We also don't import very much of that. That's still around that 3%. The picture is very different when we do this same chart for milk fat. We export much less milk fat, as I'd alluded to, and we import proportionally more, to the extent where in the first half of this period on the chart, we were a trade deficit. We had a trade deficit in milk fat. We imported more in the form of butter, fat, and other mixture products that we exported. That switched about the middle here where they were kind of balanced. Then we went briefly to a fairly significant trade export surplus of fat, but that only lasted a few years, and we're back to almost close to balance. We're not making much traction in terms of the international market contributing on a net basis to the markets for U.S. dairy farmers and the milk they produce. That's something that has to change, and probably the best opportunity for doing that is to get our cheese exports, good as they are, boosted up more than where they are now. You recall those early charts where the green line wasn't too much below the red line. That ideally would change. That's the main thing that can move this chart in more positive territories for dairy farmers. Okay, let's switch back to the domestic market. I said about, we're heading on to 17% of our solids production is exported. Obviously, that means that the domestic commercial market still is very important. It's more than 80% of your market. What's driving that? What's making that so relatively constant? What's driving that increase? Well, the one thing we have going in our favor is the population of the United States is growing. It's not explosively, it's not like certain countries, but it is growing, and that means that every year there are more people who are consuming milk and dairy products. So that's a windfall just right there. That happens, and will continue to happen. But turning to per capita consumption, what's happening at the individual consumer level when you average it over all consumers, how much dairy and how much individual dairy products is the average consumer in this country consuming? And that's a positive picture as well for many products. On this one is American type cheese, cheddar, and again, as I mentioned earlier, in red. Other cheese, mostly mozzarella driven by pizza. Very steady growth in per capita consumption, meaning over time, each person in the United States, on average, is consuming more of these. That's what we want. That is good. That is a sign of a healthy industry. Interestingly enough, for American consumers, their rate of increasing consumption is much more heavily on the non-American type cheese basis. Mozzarella, particularly, is outgrowing cheddar, and some of those are the key varieties in each of these categories. Cheddar is the big one in American type. Mozzarella is the big one in other type cheese. They've crossed over basically in the later 1980s, and other type cheese has been gaining increasingly on American cheese, and that will probably continue. Again, this is one of those constants in the industry. Butter consumption has been a little more stagnant in terms of per capita. It's ticked up a little bit, but butter has been subject, and the next slide is going to take a much longer look, going back almost 100 years, and puts a story to this. This is a chart of per capita consumption of butter in the United States, going back almost 100 years, and illustrating the phases of what I call almost a century of onslaughts on U.S. butter consumption. Butter is probably second only to fluid milk in the hearts of dairy farmers, and it has had lots of headwinds. Starting out with the Great Depression, basically, in the Roaring *20s, according to USDA data, consumers in the United States consumed almost 18 pounds of butter a year. That started slipping during the Great Depression when affordability became a concern. World War II brought in butter rationing, had a big impact. It was lifted at the end of the war, but then margarine came in and offered some very steep competition, further reduction. And then that war on dietary fat consumption I talked about earlier basically kept butter consumption down on the mat, down to what I would say, the folks who were consuming butter at that time were the hardcore, and as well as in commercial bakery use. It has only recently recovered, again, to a great extent, helped by Chekhov-funded research, along with a lot of others that helped finally realize fat was not the issue. Carbohydrates were the culprit. fat. Butter is starting to recover. It's getting back close to where it was in 1965, sort of further along in the margarine competition. It's got a long way to go to get back to, say, immediate post-World War II levels, and it's got a long way to go to get back to pre-depression levels, but it's working on it, let's say. Fluid milk consumption on per capita basis is going down, obviously, because even with population growth, total fluid consumption has been declining, and that definitely is happening on a per capita consumption basis. Averaging all of per capita dairy consumption on a milk equivalent basis, it's been steadily increasing. It looks kind of unstable because the scale on the left-hand side is so narrow. It starts at 550 pounds per year and goes up to 590. So that's a very narrow window. If you looked at it in total, this would look a lot more stable. Now, we hear a lot of talk from people who are not necessarily dairy farmers about keeping prices down is very important so that we don't hurt consumption. Supermarkets, where a lot of dairy is sold, try their hardest to keep prices of products fairly stable. Consumers don't like it when they're unstable, but there's nonetheless some volatility, and that's illustrated here in basically a price series. It's interrupted because the Bureau of Labor Statistics that reports this has been a little uneven. Cheddar, processed cheese, whole milk, and butter. There is some price volatility, but to understand, is this important for consumers' behavior? We got to look a little technically at something called demand elasticities, which is simply a measure, an economic measure of the change in consumption results from each 1% change in a variable affects demand, like prices and incomes. The most recent report to Congress on the impact of the promotion programs, there's one that comes out every year, estimates those elasticities, and in the own price elasticity, what's called basically, what happens to consumption of butter when prices change by 1%? Obviously, it goes down. That's why it has a negative sign. It has for all of these. But you'll see that this number is very small, so that if prices change by 1%, you're only going to lose, according to these estimates, 0.12, basically only an eighth as much in percentage terms of consumption. And the same thing's for cheese and fluid milk. They do this analysis for exports on an aggregate basis, fat and skim solids basis. Exports are a little more sensitive to prices. These are consumers that are relatively new to dairy, and we have competition, unlike the domestic market. We have to compete on a price basis with other suppliers like New Zealand and the European Union. But on an all dairy basis, what's called inelastic demand. Meaning consumers, they may complain about prices, but they don't react very much to changes in prices. No matter what happens to prices, they're pretty dependable in their consumption of dairy products, individually and collectively. The same is kind of true in terms of you can do the same thing for incomes. These are positive mostly. When incomes go up, consumption tends to go up. And again, these are less than 1, so that dairy consumption is not real sensitive to incomes, which I guess is, it'd be nice if they were more sensitive to incomes, if incomes were increasing, but overall, in the aggregate, the statistics indicate that consumer income is relatively stagnant. Way up in the top few percent, it's going great. But for the average consumer, not so much. And having a low income elasticity means that the consumption of milk and dairy products is relatively resistant to economic downturns like recessions. It's more sensitive, again, in the export side, as we'd expect with consumers just relatively newly coming to dairy. But on an aggregate basis for all dairy and on a fat basis, not much sensitivity to incomes. So this slide just basically sums up what I just said. Another thing that might affect, so again, consumption of milk and dairy is relatively insensitive to price changes. to economic recessions, to economic circumstances. Promotion is something that also affects consumption. Again, that's something that gets measured every year. These are a couple of key quotes. I've been working with the Dairy Management Incorporated on communicating the results of these studies. This is done, sort of with fancy econometric analysis by a former colleague of mine when I was in the faculty of Virginia Tech. Sums up, all that analysis says dairy promotion under the national promotion programs have effectively increased demand for dairy products, period. And the gains in profit at the farm level from that were far larger than the costs associated with the national programs. So to sum up this piece on consumption, U.S. consumers provide a healthy, steadily growing market for the products produced from milk sold by U.S. dairy farmers. They're increasing their overall per capita consumption of dairy. Their dairy consumption is relatively insensitive to changing prices and economic conditions, and they respond positively to promotion. Now let's talk about what the picture looks like on the international side, and let me flip one more consumption-related slide to this. We often hear about the importance of exports because 95% of the world's population lives outside the U.S. That's kind of true. That green line down there shows the changing share of the U.S. changing share of world population. It's kind of hovering just below 5%. That's interesting, but it's kind of not important for talking about the importance of U.S. dairy exports to U.S. dairy farmers. Why? Well, not every one of those 95% out there buy milk and dairy products. The market overseas for milk and dairy products are folks that are what we call middle class. They have middle class incomes, they have discretionary incomes, and they spend that for things like dairy products. And it's been shown over and over again, when consumers around the world have suddenly have the economic wherewithal to purchase somewhat relatively expensive products like dairy, they do so willingly, enthusiastically. And it doesn't matter. You can have populations that have eaten nothing but rice for thousands of years. When they have access to dairy and the incomes to buy dairy, they do dairy. They've never seen it before. They've never tasted it before in large numbers. But they will increase their consumption of dairy. Now, the issue here is the Brookings Institute did a study some years ago charting and forecasting the number of middle-class consumers in the world, forecast out for many years, and the volume of middle-class incomes in all the different countries of the world. These are forecasts of the people and the economic resources they have to buy dairy products. And the bottom line is that middle-class consumers and their middle-class incomes have been growing outside of the developed countries, not just the U.S., including the U.S., but not just the U.S. The developed countries are kind of stagnant in terms of the growth of their middle class and the middle-class incomes. It's growing faster in other countries, particularly countries that are dairy deficit and like and will buy dairy products. That's critical, and this is reflected in this chart, which is the shares, not of population in the green line, but the shares the U.S. has of the middle-class population, forecast in the future, the brown, and the middle-class consumption spending. And it's not good news because the U.S. is losing its share of access in its own domestic market to these middle-class consumers and their disposable incomes. We're already producing a larger share of the world's milk in the blue line than our share of middle-class populations. And in a few more years, our share of world milk production is going to exceed the share of middle-class consumption spending. That is the more telling and more critical set of statistics for why it is important to export dairy products, not how many total population is outside the United States. So to summarize the non-U.S. consumer part of this, these folks provide also a healthy and steadily growing market for the products produced from milk sold by U.S. dairy farmers, probably even more important in the long term as an addition to the domestic market. These consumers are more challenging to supply. There's stiff competition from other suppliers, as I mentioned, and the U.S. has come relatively late to the dairy export game. to kind of summarize this, New Zealand is a major competitor. They have needed to export most of their dairy products for years and years. They produce a lot. They don't have a big population. For many years, they basically, the UK, Great Britain, the United Kingdom was their market. The New Zealanders are very closely tied to the UK. The UK some years ago joined the European Common Market, now called the EU, and the New Zealanders lost that access because when you joined the EU, you had to get behind that EU tariff wall and stop importing other than relatively small amounts. New Zealand was successful in negotiating a fairly sizable butter import quota just to the UK, but they basically lost a good part of their market. They had to become good at exporting to other markets, and they did it, and they're good at it. The European Union is an industry that's competitive with ours on a price and cost basis, but they've had the advantage that their basic safety net program, because the government is heavily involved up until recently in providing safety net support to its dairy farmers. There are a lot more of them in Europe, and they get noisy. When they're unhappy, they drive tractors through the streets of Paris and do other things. The advantage the EU has is for many years, its safety net program was providing money for the commercial dairy industry in the European Union countries to export dairy products with government subsidies. Whereas in the U.S., our basic safety net was a price support program. When prices went low, we bought dairy products and stored them in the domestic market where those stocks overhung our prices and had to be dealt with. The Europeans recognized early on, sell it. If you're going to spend that money, move it overseas. That way it doesn't come back to haunt you. The way I look at it, the European Union dairy industry had for decades a free education on how to become commercial major league exporters paid for by their governments. Their government trained them and encouraged them to become world-class exporters, and they're good at it. And when the market, at the time when those subsidies finally were phased out, the world market became commercial. They didn't need them anymore, and they had all that experience. The U.S., what we knew how was to buy surplus products and put them in caves under Kansas City. We have had to play catch-up. We've never really paid that much attention to the world market up until recently, but it is critical. It is critical. So, given all that good news about consumption, why is it sometimes so challenging for U.S. dairy farmers to supply this incredible, steadily and predictably growing resource? Well, this gets us into the question of what's challenging is obviously milk prices, okay? This is a chart of the U.S. average milk price reported by USDA. This is anything but stable, obviously. You know that as dairy farmers. The same thing is true if we look at the price-cost margin. This is the margin as it's currently computed under the Dairy Margin Coverage Program. It's a very simple measure of feed costs, but it's closely correlated with actual margins experienced by U.S. dairy farmers. I mean, this thing is, look, we've gone as low as $2 a hundredweight price over feed costs, and as high as $15 a hundredweight. I mean, that's not constancy, that's not stability. Okay, how can that happen? Well, I can't explain it totally, but let me move the ball forward a little bit. Little game I play. Explain milk pricing in 20 words. Okay, can you come up with 20 words that can explain milk pricing? Okay, I'm going to cheat. Okay, let's make it 33 words. These are the 33 words with the 20 in bold. Due to their key role in the federal milk marketing order pricing formulas, prices of butter, cheddar cheese, non-fat dry milk, and dry whey mostly determine U.S. average milk prices each month. I use this for my forecasting. I construct what I call a four-product fixed formula, which basically just works through what's equivalent to a national blend price working through the federal order price formulas to come up with an estimate of what those basically U.S. average milk prices are. U.S. milk prices are heavily influenced by the federal order program, but federal orders don't cover much more than 20% of the milk, or 50% of the milk at the moment. What's interesting about this is that when you overlay this simple, naive, four-product fixed formula, which I haven't really updated the utilization numbers for this whole period, even though they've changed, they come very close to predicting what USDA reports for milk prices, to the point where sometimes I think that that's how the USDA puts their numbers out. But no, they assure me they have a sophisticated statistical sampling process. And I adjust them from here using a monthly basis, which gets them even more closer. So if you want to understand milk prices, if you understand what moves the prices of those four products, I can't give you a percentage, but you're some percentage of the way to understanding milk prices. Forget all that federal order stuff, which makes eyes glaze over or people run in terror. And just look at what's happening for the markets for those four products. Okay, let's get back finally to the dairy cow productivity part of this picture. U.S. milk production per cow over this period in this chart, again, very stable. Dependably increasing 31% over this period. Through economic good times and bad, there's a little bit, if you run a trend line here, this is very slightly curved trend line, but it's almost something you could predict for cow productivity using this simple trend line. Yeah, during, let's say, 2009, when prices were particularly bad, we had a drop off that trend line, but the next year it caught up and got back on track. One of the most stable, predictable relationships in the dairy industry. Now, let me amplify on this. The standard measure of dairy cow productivity is milk production per cow, but really the important one that's need to measure particularly for market analysis purposes, is milk solids production per cow, not liquid milk production per cow. And why is that? Well, on the farm level, 88% of the milk pooled on federal marketing orders last year were paid on components. So the more components you produce, the more money you're going to get, not on a fat skim basis. And total for larger macro purposes, total milk solids production is more appropriate measure for total supply-demand price analysis than liquid milk production. Why is that? Well, the liquid component of raw milk determines product yield for a very small proportion of dairy products, mostly the skim portion of fluid milk and conventional yogurt. Everything else is kind of solid standardized. Cheeses, butter. Butter composition is defined in federal law as 80% fat. Milk solids production per cow has been growing faster than milk production in recent years as average milk solids composition of milk has grown. This is a chart, shows monthly, but you get a trend line of the average fat test for the last 26 years. Very stable. The average test of milk was 3.67% for many years, suddenly started heading up and accelerated around 2015 or so. Why? Well, you recall we had a huge surge in milk prices just before that period, and then a crash in milk prices. The skim solids portion of milk values plummeted. Protein, non-fat solids, other solids, all went in the tank in that post-2014 price collapse. Butter prices were the shining star. That was the early years when butter rebounded from the recovery from that anti-fat rhetoric, and consumption came back very, very strong to the point where butter prices were bid up to, on a sustainable basis, between $2.20 and $2.40. By my calculations, this is just a calculation I've made of the contribution of milk fat to the average all milk price. In other words, the proportion of your milk checks that I estimated comes from fat versus the skim. And for many years, the average of a little below 40% of the milk checks came from the basically paying for butter fat. That jumped up for a period here to almost 60%. What did farmers do? They did what they're good at. They took the economic situation they were handed They reacted to it. They were making nothing from their skim. They were making everything from their fat. They increased fat. Guess what? Same thing happened because when you increase fat, you generally increase protein. These numbers are from a different branch of USDA that looks at things a little bit differently. I would have expected this to follow the same flat and then increasing trajectory, but these are the numbers. If you compare the change, year-over-year change, in the production of milk and milk solids, in the beginning of this chart, they grew about the same rate. But then, about the middle, milk solids production started growing faster than milk fat, than total liquid milk production. To the point where if you run a trend line, linear trend lines on that, you'll see there's been a slight increase in the rate of growth in total milk solids production, a slight decline in the growth rate of total liquid milk production. To the point where if you go back to that same kind of chart and do this on milk solids, you'll see that, again, very steady, constant growing relationship, but up this time 36% over this period, not 31%. Fit a linear trend line to that, and it looks kind of the same. It's a very, very solid forecast of what milk solids production per cow is going to look like in future years. So growth in dairy cow productivity, along with growth in total dairy consumption, is another relatively constant factor in the industry, but it's also it's insensitive to prices. You know, no matter what farm prices are, it seems like just replacing dairy cows will get you increases in production per cow and milk solids production per cow. But it's a relationship between these two fundamental constant factors, consumption growth, cow productivity growth, that is a key driver in the current dairy situation. And the bottom line is when consumption growth lags, this is kind of basic dairy economics. Cow numbers become excessive and milk prices come under pressure. When cow productivity lags, cow numbers become insufficient for total consumption needs. Milk prices rise and stimulate more production through more milk cows. And the demand elasticities in dairy make milk prices particularly sensitive to this balance. And so I'm going to go back and revisit the discussion on demand elasticities and flip something. Dairy consumption is not very sensitive to price and income changes. But that means that in the consumer-focused case, relatively large changes in prices did not generate big changes in consumption. Flip that, and relatively small changes in supply generate relatively large changes in prices. That is a fixture of inelastic demand. It's what makes dairy promotion so effective. If you can move the needle a little bit on consumption, it'll have a bigger impact on prices. It's what makes supply management work for those countries that do supply management. If you can constrict that supply, it has a big impact on prices. Not something that we've used very much in this country or are likely to. So if you look at changes in milk solids production, total commercial use, they track pretty closely. There's a little bit more of a downward trend from the numbers in total commercial use. But they come together in that sort of shifting balance one way or the other that I talked about. And I'm going to end up with just 2 more slides, and then we'll take questions. That shifting balance between productivity growth and cow productivity growth and consumption growth that switches from too much, too little, and affects cow numbers, that works out in very predictable, what I call cow cycles. This chart shows over this period when these bars, red bars, are above the 0 line, that's a month in which cow numbers that month are greater than they were in the same month the year before. They show that on an annual basis, the dairy herd was growing in those months. When the bars are below the 0 line, that's a month when dairy cow numbers were below the previous month. And you'll notice these go in very predictable cycles. They're sort of very bell-shaped curves here. Let me explain the first few of them, and then I'll flip to my last slide, which makes it more explicit. During the late 90s through up until when exports kind of took off, basically U.S. dairy, U.S. milk had mostly the domestic market, a relatively small proportion of exports. And it regularly overshot and undershot that supply-demand balance to the point where we had these alternating cycles of dairy herd growth, dairy herd decline, dairy herd growth, dairy herd decline. We got to 2005, and we had two big cow expansion cycles. That was a time when the U.S. was drawn heavily first into the domestic market, into the export market. There was a shortfall in production from New Zealand and Australia in particular. Importers flocked to the U.S. to get dairy because we were the reserve supply they needed. We expanded dairy exports tremendously. That was that earlier chart where exports really grew. Let me switch now that you're kind of used to this. Let me continue this explanation, and then I'll take questions. By complicating this a little bit more, I'm overlaying the same cow cycle chart with the chart of milk prices. I could have used margins, but let's use milk prices because that's what everybody talks about. You'll notice that during that period of regular cow expansion and contraction cycles, milk prices were low, relatively speaking, when cow numbers were expanding. This was a delayed reaction. Producers responded to periods of stronger dairy prices by expanding cow numbers. That brought milk prices down because it kind of overshot the mark. When cow numbers declined, that tightened the markets and milk prices went up. In these early years, the milk prices are kind of lower than later, and that was because you recall that feed prices went up big time starting around 2006. And feed prices over time generally track what milk prices are. So milk prices were lower, but the cycles of cow number expansions accompanied by milk price declines and vice versa, very, very striking at that point. During the second cow cycle expansion, due to that expansion of dairy exports, we had the rare period when cow numbers were growing and milk prices were strong. We just couldn't get enough milk to supply that growing export market. But then the recession in 2008 hit. New Zealand and Australian production recovered. We still had our price support program that put a floor under our prices that gave New Zealand and Australia a target to shoot under. And we lost those recently gained exports very heavily during 2009. That's what caused the debacle of 2009 prices. And you can see that heavy down cycle of cow numbers following that big price decline. And it was amplified by the last and largest of the Cooperatives Working Together program dairy herd retirements. We recovered from that and went through another period when cow numbers were growing and milk prices were also growing. Then we had that period in 2013, 2014 when prices went through the roof. Again, this was caused by international events. China had converted its dairy industry from a lot of mom and pop small dairy producers following the melamine problem, converted to large-scale commercial dairy farms. They found out, surprise, surprise, you can't just suddenly learn how to effectively manage a large dairy herd. They had tremendous shortfalls in their own milk production. They imported what I call every drop of milk on the planet. It was a time when production was not increasing much in the U.S., New Zealand, or the EU. That's what drove prices to those unprecedented levels, and it basically cut off what normally would have been a contraction cycle. And then, not surprising, shortly following that huge price increase, we went through another expansion cycle. But at a time that brought milk prices down and prices stayed down. What happened? For some reason, we had another expansion cycle, that second one there around 1917. We didn't need that one. That milk was not needed, and it drove prices down. And it wasn't until 2019 that we finally, after several years of low milk prices, we finally had a contraction cycle, almost 10 years since the last one. Not good. And prices reacted very quickly, and we came out of that 2019 focused contraction cycle and went immediately into the most aggressive expansion cycle in the first few months up through March 2020, ran smack dab into the pandemic. And you see what it did to prices. But ragged as it is, during the pandemic months, we have had another and one of the largest herd expansion cycles. Prices were not that good, but they were augmented by the heavy amount of direct payments that were made last year. But that's coming to an end now. It's holding milk prices down. We need to get those cow numbers down for prices to really, really recover and hopefully go into at least a steady state, if not another cow contraction cycle. So with that, I appreciate your patience, and I'm here to take any questions you might have. Teresa here will run a microphone around.
Thanks for this information. I can't help but think, though, that some type of management plan might help with this, to address this problem. Could you possibly speak to that?
I've been in. I don't disagree with you. I've been with National Milk many years, and I'd love to have $1 for every time we've said let's support supply management. I'm convinced the United States Congress will not legislate a supply management program, and they'll never get uniform support amongst dairy farmers. It's been interesting because the opposition to supply management is not fixed geographically. It was the upper Midwest when I first came. Small dairy farmers felt threatened by the growth of milk production in the West. You know, in the run-up to the 2014 Farm Bill, California was a hotbed of supply management. The upper Midwest, at least parts of it, were against supply management. They were growing commercially. So getting a consensus amongst dairy farmers to overcome the huge opposition in Congress is just going to be a lift that I don't expect to see in my lifetime. What is instructive is in the early months of the pandemic, in April and May last year, you'll recall that the situation was so dire because you suddenly had a huge drop in food service use of dairy and a surge in retail use. It took a while for the supply chains to switch. You have pizza cheese being delivered to pizzerias in big cartons, big corrugated cardboard containers of frozen pelleted pizza cheese that you put on a pizza and it melts just at the right time. You can't sell that product retail. You have to reconfigure that packaging. It took a while. And a lot of milk was dumped. And the cooperatives of the country, who normally compete with each other, hate to close their memberships because some other cooperative will take the members away from them. They bit the bullet and collectively got together, and we had 2 months of strong base excess programs. And if you look at the numbers, it had a big positive impact in getting production quickly under control. So it works. It just politically is something that's not going to happen legislatively. If dairy farmers are serious about it, they have to work through their cooperatives and get them to cooperate together. So yeah, I agree with your sentiment, but in terms of speaking from my years of experience in the political sphere, it's just too heavy a lift to get that done politically.